Welcome to the Blackheath History Forum, and thank you for tuning in on yet another Saturday afternoon. My name's Catherine Bishop, and I am on the Blackheath History Forum committee who put these series of lectures together. And I'm speaking from Darugin country, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This is the third of our seminars, and we're once again online. And as we're mostly all in lockdown to varying degrees, I felt it was kind of appropriate last week that we all learned some new swear words to express our feelings about being in lockdown. And of course, this week we are learning about what it's like to be mad. And I think we can all appreciate some of the insanity that was going on in the colony. And because we're all experiencing some sort of horrible feelings at the moment. Anyway, to cheer us up, we're going to hear about Bedlam in Botany Bay. And we're going to hear about this from James Dunk, who is a lecturer at Sydney University, and he wrote the prize-winning Bedlam at Botany Bay, which won the Premier's History Award for Australian history last year. We're going to hear from Jamie for about 45 minutes, and then we will have question time. You can put questions into the chat alongside the video at any time, and we will collect those at the end, and then we will ask Jamie them and hope that he can answer them in an intelligent manner. So without further ado, I would like to introduce James Dunk.
Thanks, Cass, and thanks very much to the committee for inviting me to speak this afternoon. I want to acknowledge as I start the Wandjil people on whose land I live and at the moment think and write and teach, and to pay my respects to past and present elders and to any First Nations people who are here today. Sovereignty has never been ceded. I want to talk today about narrative, coherence, and the place of the accidental parts of human experience in our history writing. It's narrative, of course, that renders the past legible, that makes it make sense. Much of our thinking and writing about the past is the gathering of material into the shape of a narrative that tracks along a certain arc. Where do we begin? What revealing vignette do we take as a point of departure? What scene that actually more or less took place will efficiently introduce the themes that are going to come. Themes selected from the vastness of memory and experience to be highlighted and understood. We look for narrative shapes in the records of the past. Historians use narrative to make sense of the world, to make meaning. These narratives require a kind of coherence to function, an agreed system of signs and meanings. And coherent narratives draw from human material that is assumed to be coherent. At the same time, it's narrative which renders the past communicable to others. Whatever we see and however we organize our own thoughts about the things we're researching, sharing them with others requires us to wrap them in narratives, to present them to the world. The story I want to tell you about today is, by coincidence, one of the best found narrative arcs I've ever come across. And we'll get to it shortly. But when I first began working on the book in which I've written this story, Bedlam at Botany Bay, I wasn't thinking as clearly about narrative. I was doing a PhD. I was becoming a scholar. I was thinking about evidence. My doctoral research proceeded from a very simple starting point, a historical fact, that Lachlan Macquarie established a lunatic asylum at Castle Hill in 1811. This was a surprise, which, as Robert Darnton had shown me in my undergraduate years, is an excellent place to start a historical project. Strangeness is a hallmark of historical change. So what was this asylum? What was it like? How was it built? How did it function? What happened inside? What sort of people were treated there and by whom? What sort of treatments were they offered or subjected to? How did people enter? How did they leave? The jarring quality that makes these questions particularly interesting came from the surroundings of this asylum, which it turns out was not much more than a barn with a few beds, a retrofitted cookhouse, and a wooden fence. But this barn asylum stood within a penal colony, where people who had been forced halfway around the planet were worked and flogged and freed. Here was an asylum where these people went, or were rather sent, to find inner peace, healing, order, to find asylum. This image of a barn standing lonely on a tired and abandoned government farm became only more jarring as I learned more about the colony around it. Families were broken up or attenuated by transportation. Convicts lived in discretionary arrangements with masters and subsisted in the juridical mercy of untrained judges and magistrates. They were cogs in a slow and hulking legal system and labour system that stretched across the oceans. Floggings and hangings were regular spectacles which brought those systems into stark relief in Sydney and elsewhere. The military, which governors looked to for support as they established the inchoate rule of law, showed themselves to be monopolising corrupt grifters, sucking New South Wales dry and threatened to topple the delicate, overstretched infrastructure of imperial power. The asylum itself, as I wrote in my thesis and then in the book, proved to be something of an empty space historically. There are brief glimpses in occasional correspondence. Admit this man or this woman by the authority of this letter, I am, etc., this secretary or this magistrate. But as for patient registers, medicines, treatments, any indication of how the madness of patients related to the extreme vectors of their experience of exile and the violence of settler colonialism, crickets. On these questions, what survives is effectively metadata. Staffing arrangements, occasional instructions, requisitions for carts and donkeys, suits of slops, beer, bread, paper, and quills. A painting of the asylum site when it was still a government farm. There are a few more intriguing indicators from these asylums. Until 1848, the colony's asylums were not run by doctors, but by jailers and generalists. And the doctors who treated the patients came into frequent conflict with those superintendents. In the late 1830s, the governor emphasised that the asylums were precisely not hospitals and did not come under the purview of the colonial medical system. There are occasional patient lists in the surviving records that give partial and fleeting impressions of the gender breakdown in the asylum, but little proper data about age, occupation, religion. This is not really the stuff of history from below. In the midst of all this impressionistic evidence, that initial jarring image took gradual shape into a hypothesis about inner life in the early colony. It went something like this. Extreme experience takes its toll, regardless of what medical language or classifications are available to recognize it. The history of madness reveals the burdens of transportation and colonial life by bringing a range of elements of colonial experience together into a non-medical or extra-medical and extra-legal classification, which I've called madness here. This included formal kinds of mental illness when it was recognized, but also vague and casual references to inner states, words like derangement, to legal rulings like lunacy, but also to the broader anxiety, the suffering, the despair, which these references and diagnoses point towards. Current psychological knowledge indicates that traumatic experience registers in delusions and hallucinations, in incoherent words, and also in silence, which is neither coherent nor incoherent. It indicates too that these traumatic effects are often refracted between people and across generations. It seemed that writing the history of madness could be a means of illuminating these elements that have tended to lie beneath the surface or at the very edges of our historical narratives. But what methods would allow me to prove or disprove this hypothesis? Where first were the records of madness? In hospitals and asylum files, of course. But I wanted to research the asylums of the penal colony. Although there were a handful of patient lists from Liverpool Asylum in the 1820s, there were only full case registers from Tarban Creek from the late 1840s, which were established and created only after a very particularly vicious select committee demanded them, which is an excellent story for another time. This means that the hospital registers of mental illness began after convict transportation to New South Wales ended. They had little to say about the madness of a penal colony. I did find a superb set of patient records from New Norfolk Asylum in Tasmania from the 1830s, however, and I spent a lot of time capturing and then transcribing data before I realized that all of this was distracting me from that initial image and from the hypothesis that was still taking shape. There was some interesting material folded into those registers, snippets of life history taken on admission, details of delusions, like a woman who'd been in a Dublin asylum who then decided that the Australian colonies would be the best place for her mental health. So she committed a string of minor crimes until she was transported there. But how then do we really get at the history of madness if not through these records of psychiatric or proto-psychiatric institutions? There were few doctors who worked closely with the mentally ill in these early decades. Those that did had little specialist training. Psychiatry was at best emergent in the early 19th century. And the doctors who worked in asylums in Sydney tended to be transported convicts rather than the best minds of their generation. There was no theory of psychological trauma, no PTSD. I looked through penal settlement and court papers and the correspondence of the colonial secretaries, searching for any evidence that people looked up from the individual symptoms in front of them, from the cases, to the conditions of colonial life, to more structural factors, that they saw any connection between madness and the colonial project. There was a list of likely causes of insanity written by one doctor called William Bland, the dueling doctor that Penny Russell has written about. Bland was surgeon at the Asylum at Castle Hill for 4 or 5 months in 1814. He was disgusted to find, when he arrived there, no medicines at all, other supplies low, the buildings in disrepair, patients escaping frequently, an evangelical amateur botanist in charge and leading the patients in Sunday prayers, and as he said, in all other respects, the establishment was as bad as possible. Bland left as quickly as he could. He was held up slightly by being a convict himself under sentence for successfully dueling his purser in Bombay. And later he was asked by the Commissioner of Inquiry, John Thomas Bigg, whether he'd been able to form any opinion as to the causes of lunacy for the 20-odd patients in his care at Castle Hill. It was already a tentative question, and Bland gave a quite vague answer. They'd become mad, he said, from religious fanaticism, from intoxication, and other causes, constitutional and otherwise. 2 cases, he said, arose from the mere circumstances of transportation. The Commissioner, perhaps assuming he meant that their symptoms had been caused by severe discipline, asked if their crimes had been especially serious. But no, they'd been involved in the Irish Rebellion, said Bland, and they'd been transported for their political opinions. We have another glimpse of these structural factors in a stray, exasperated line penned by Governor Darling in 1828, riding to Downing Street very nearly at the end of his tether. There'd been a string of suicides of people associated with government in those years, which the governor wrote off really as dissolute and immoral types coming to a kind of natural justice. But then Charles Throsby, a former military doctor and a wealthy and respected grazier who sat on the Legislative Council, killed himself. After a difficult search to replace him on the council, Darling's preferred candidate also tried to kill himself. And as that man recovered in hospital, Darling wrote in frustration, perhaps persons who've suffered from any temporary aberration of mind should not be sent to this colony. If there's nothing in the climate which induces in colonists absolute derangement, there is undoubtedly something peculiar which affects the spirits and produces extraordinary depression. But Darling didn't pursue the thought, and I've not found any doctors or scientists who took up the problem of a climatic derangement or depression in these early years. George Sutter, who happened to be the superintendent of Castle Hill in the 1810s, the very evangelical botanist I just mentioned, had earlier been fined and imprisoned for supporting William Bligh in the 1808 rebellion. And the asylum appointment was likely a payment for services rendered to the Crown. He wrote in his memoirs, sometime later, that 2 of the 3 leading rebels went mad. The 3rd killed himself. Malcolm Ellis, the biographer of one of those 3, John MacArthur, tallied up the prominent people who succumbed to mental illness in New South Wales in these years, succumbed to mental illness or killed themselves. And he wrote of madness as the Botany Bay disease, the scourge of the penal colony. But he also did not pursue the thought. Why, if madness was indeed endemic in this place at time, why didn't Darling or Sutter go into it any further? Why didn't Ellis take it up as a historical problem? Why hasn't anyone else? It becomes clear enough after some thinking and researching that even if a handful of observers gave the outlines of an epidemiology of madness in a penal colony, no one writing at the time could write about madness in any meaningful structural way. How could they? How were doctors and civil authorities, governors, to deal with a madness that seemed to bear some relation to the project at the heart of the colony, to convict transportation and discipline, to exile and banishment? and also coursing through the adjacent colonial projects, those that were going on, private projects around. A volatile and capricious economy, uncertain and heavy-handed regulation, frontier violence bringing terror and also guilt, and the resistance of ecosystems to northern knowledge, reminding farmers that they were out of place here. Here, the very possibility of prosperity and peace for convicted criminals became not only fraught moral terrain, but a prospect which could further intensify the weight of commercial or personal failure. Without then much evidence from colonial medicine, and with only glimpses of reflections on a broader history of madness, I needed another way of thinking about madness historically. I came across a book called The Man Who Thought He Was Napoleon, Towards a Political History of Madness by a French literary scholar and a member of the House of Murat, which began when Napoleon made his brother-in-law Prince Francais and then King of Naples. Murat draws on dreams and delusions and the early history of psychiatry in France to map madness against the shifting terrain of the political structures, formal and informal, by which it was contained and controlled and cared for. The political history of madness, which Murat's book is working towards, remains an emerging subfield today, loosely defined, amorphous, uncommon. It's a fitting approach for the history of revolutionary France, which was a key site for both the development of psychiatry and for political history, of course. Murat argues that this was no accident, that the history of politics and madness intertwined in these heady years. She shows how the surviving imprints of inner madness capture a new dimension of that charged century, that climate. And looking at how scientists and superintendents and lawyers and bureaucrats dealt with madness helped us understand the revolutionary state in new ways. It struck me that New South Wales was just as good a site as revolutionary France for the political history of madness. Its social, cultural, and political turbulence, its haphazard recombinations and innovations of older, broader themes, all made wonderful material. But here the methods had to be different, since in other ways this place was almost the inverse of 19th century France, with its marshalling of science and technology and bureaucracy to treat and control mental illness and other forms of social problems. In New South Wales, there were no real asylums, no institutions that would have been recognized as asylums in Paris at this point for full 50 years of colonization. There were no real superintendents, no medical advances, no sophisticated theories. And yet there was a flourishing of madness and a wild, turbid suspension of legal, political, and social concepts and structures, a great denaturing and renaturing. This approach helped open up the site of analysis beyond these early asylums to court cases, where judges and jurors discuss the difference between sanity and insanity in everyday terms, pointing to the particular decorums and anxieties of a penal colony, and beyond the courtroom to civil authorities planning for and around madness, and further to the history of peripheral, partial, fleeting madness and other kinds of mental disorder. Those aspects which are not recognized by judges or doctors, but which, playing at the edge of society and outside those institutions, created a wide wake through prisons, penal settlements, courtrooms and hospitals, and through households, farms, churches, communities. By way of example, I want to share with you today the story of John Grant. It's quite a long story, and I want to spend most of the time that we have left with him. Grant was tried for assault and breaking the peace at the Old Bailey in 1803. His lawyer, a man called Coherence, attempted an insanity defense. But James Hadfield had been acquitted of attempted regicide just 3 years prior, and the legal establishment was in a reactionary mood. Grant came up against a cold judge who thought that when he had shot at the lawyer who'd stood between him and the young heiress that he was courting, not very well, he knew exactly what he was doing. Even though Grant had loaded the pistol with swan shot, which is, fine shot that's meant for hunting and not for killing people. And even though he'd only just broken the skin of the old lawyer's ham, which is the flesh between the thigh and the buttock, and ruined his jacket, he was found guilty of breaking the peace and sentenced to death. Just 12 hours before his scheduled execution, this sentence was commuted to transportation. We can speculate on what the wait might have done to him, what waiting for death did to a young man in kind of his particular sensibilities. Certainly he grew frail whilst he waited for transportation, for the sentence to be carried out. But on the voyage out to New South Wales, young, educated and amiable as he was, Grant befriended the officers rather than the convicts, who he had kind of strong words for. He befriended the officers and was even invited to share the cabin of the 22-year-old captain, until that captain drank himself to death outside Rio de Janeiro and died in the grip of hallucinations that made a very strong impression on the young John Grant. He wrote home to his mother and sister that the poor captain had been handed too much responsibility, too much freedom, more than he could bear. Grant continued writing letters home and journaling and writing poetry during his 7 years in New South Wales, producing just a wonderful set of documents that were found, kind of amazingly, in a London bank vault in the 1950s. His writing and the kind of material it points to within indicates that if he was not quite insane enough for the English legal system, he was not quite sane enough to survive New South Wales intact. Grant arrived in Sydney with a dozen letters of introduction to many of the society's leading lights. And he further leveraged these by deploying his charisma, his educated conversation, his genteel manners, his music, to find friends and allies. But he also fell in with less helpful types. He became friends with two political transportees and was quickly drawn into radical protests against the system of convict transportation, the system, as he called it, of slavery. He wrote fine words, poems about the glory of the Magna Carta. He wrote multiple letters to the governor denouncing this horrid system, transportation, this thing of deep contempt in the opinion of all Englishmen. Soon enough, he was called before a bench of magistrates on a charge of sedition. Several allies sat on the bench, including Judge Advocate Richard Atkins, whom Grant had met soon after arriving in Sydney. Atkins, a little gentleman about 50 and most agreeable indeed, as Grant had then wrote, was one of his first patrons in the colony. Now, standing before the bench, John Grant refused to recount. The bench judged this to be not only absurd, his language, his words and letters, but in fact seditious and highly inflammatory, in a society that was still reeling from the convict uprising at Vinegar Hill and the long shadow of the Irish Rebellion. Grant was sentenced to 5 years hard labour on Norfolk Island. It was an unusual sentence at that point, not a formal retransportation, but rather part of a deliberate strategy to separate and to silence the political radicals in the colony. And so Grant went the next day to remonstrate with his sometime patron. Atkins replied, "Mr. Grant, you are acting so much against your own interests that I can guess the cause only in supposing you mad." This is mad, Grant wrote in capitals. "For although your sentiments may be most righteous, why do you espouse in this way the cause of the prisoners? We have never treated you as a prisoner." Atkins has an unglamorous place in Australian history. In 1799, he'd sued the popular surgeon John Harris for defamation for calling him a swindler. At trial, Harris pointed out that he could hardly do more damage to Atkins's reputation than Atkins himself. And while the judge advocate won the suit, it was a kind of a Pyrrhic victory. Atkins was widely known by this time as an alcoholic and a reprobate. He had in fact been those things when he first arrived there, fleeing English creditors, to nevertheless be made a magistrate, registrar of the Vice Admiralty Court, and on instruction from Downing Street, Judge Advocate of the colony. He came from a very good family. These positions, as J.M. Bennett writes in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, enabled him to enhance the aura of influential prestige behind which he sheltered from existing creditors while engaging fresh credit locally on the security of his family name. Of course, when John Grant arrived and befriended Richard Atkins, that was the prestige was what he was looking for. John MacArthur called Atkins a public cheater living in the most boundless dissipation. And the angst between them spiraled into a legal stoush, which was a test case of the distribution of power, real power in the colony, and one of the key catalysts for the 1808 rebellion. Grant had arrived at the general opinion about his patron fairly quickly. writing that Atkin's wife had to lead him to bed vomiting. It may have registered with Grant that this was one of the problems with New South Wales, that this was a place where a man with impeccable connections and implosive personal habits could hold such sway over the course of the colony and over the course of his own life. Being transported to Norfolk Island, Grant's problems deepened and his physical and mental health declined. He made a protest vow of vegetarianism, which likely caused nutritional problems, given the state of kind of rationing at that point. He wrote petitions and letters for others, which were judged to be incendiary. He was chained for his troubles, and to protest being chained, he gave up shaving. "There are those who call me insane as a consequence," he wrote in his diary. When Thomas Prosser, a United Irishman, was sent away from Norfolk Island for an affair with a married woman, it was announced that his would be auctioned off. Grant was so furious at the injustice of this iniquitous and forced sale that he tried to go to the auction, although he'd been banned from the town centre. The commandant saw him coming and yelled to the jailer, "Put him in prison! Put him in prison!" This is all from Grant's journal. I, continuing on my leisurely way, he continued, saying not a word, accompanied by the jailer, enter prison for the second time. This passage could be lifted from Don Quixote. Let me read you a few more lines. I had not been in the prison yard an hour when a bell announces that the sale of Prosser's effects is to begin, before his embarkation. I am immediately filled with hot indignation, which lends wings to my feet like another Mercury. I leap to the top of the walls which surround me, and getting down on the other side, walk softly towards the place of sale, which had commenced. I shout at the top of my voice, "This sale is not lawful, and all those who buy goods here have no legitimate right to the property at all." Everyone turns towards me, and I repeat this blunt statement, and I've since been told that many men thought I was mad. This is in scare quotes, mad, both on that account and because of my beard, which I've never touched since the day I wore irons, 7th of September last. I was soon seized by half a dozen constables and taken back to my gloomy cell for 3 hours. And yet John Grant continued, writing, speaking, and campaigning against injustice he felt too keenly. He drew up a bond of union, which he went around asking people to sign. The bond laid out a set of charges against the system and obliged signatories to sue the governors and other officers when they returned home. After writing to the local schoolteacher, Mrs. Mitchell, for details of a recent attack on her character, gathering further material for a dossier he was writing to present to Governor Bligh, things escalated. The above letter, he wrote tersely, occasioned Mr. Grant to be publicly lashed in August 1806. Besides, he has been repeatedly put in jail, his beard torn off his face by force. It's interesting that he slips out of the first person to the third person, perhaps because he can't quite come to say, "I was whipped in public." And yet he continued and continued in his ways, and the commandant finally had him rowed over to the tiny island that lay off Norfolk Island, sort of a third transportation, a third exile, and a place where he nearly died. But at some point in all this, John Grant managed to make contact with Governor William Bligh. In December 1807, Bligh instructed the commandant of Norfolk Island to send a large contingent of those who were living on the island to New Norfolk, a little settlement 30 kilometers north of Hobart on the Derwent River. "There is an unfortunate person with you whose name is Grant," he added. "If he wishes to be here, in Sydney, in preference to proceeding to the Derwent, and there is the least chance of his mind being quieted by this indulgence, let him come." Here we have a governor, notorious for his sun-burnished hardness and his naval bad language, directing the commandant of a penal station to consult the preferences of a convict undergoing hard labour for sedition, trying, it seems, to preserve that man's mental health. It seems that Bligh was understanding about Grant's case, that he understood something in Grant's words, perhaps that he was unwell, perhaps that he was simply harmless. The governor's sympathies may have been primed by his 24-year-old daughter, Anne Campbell, who suffered from epilepsy and was described as being mentally afflicted. She would later be legally declared a lunatic. But in one more twist of the screw, what might, in another setting, be called cruel fate, Bligh was deposed in a rebellion, partly precipitated by the elevation and continuing dissolution of Richard Atkins. The former governor then spent 14 months under house arrest and sailing the eastern seaboard looking for support. At one point, he ordered the ship's captain, William Kent, to fire on Sydney. Kent refused to do this, and he was later court-martialed for insubordination. It was Bligh's own act of madness. In the 4 months between the arrival of Lachlan Macquarie with a remit to restore order, and Bligh sailing for England with a ship full of witnesses, the new governor and the new judge both found him a great plague. It's a direct quote. But Bligh was a complex character, and in these last weeks in Sydney, he made a final intervention in the life of John Grant. Just 6 days before his departure, Bligh wrote this note for the tortured young man. This is to certify that Mr. John Grant is, from all I can learn, recovered from some mental derangement, and that during my knowledge of him, he has conducted himself in a mild and inoffensive manner, and bears a moral good character. Given under my hand this 6th of May, 1810, Governor Bligh. Grant, on reading Bligh's note, thought it would tend most cruelly to countenance calumny, and he returned it to the outgoing governor with some suggested revisions. Bligh, still more fascinatingly, obliged him again. This is to certify, he wrote in a second certificate, that Mr. John Grant is, from all I can learn, recovered from some mental uneasiness arising from a double cause. First, a disappointment of marriage in London and exile for checking the man occasioning it. Second, the forcing men to labour in New South Wales without pay for offences committed in England, notwithstanding and besides their banishment. And that during my knowledge of him, he has conducted himself in a mild and an inoffensive manner and bears a moral good character. This is a remarkable document, don't you think? We might call it a certificate of sanity. We might well wonder too why Grant asked for this certificate. Did he want to show his mother and his sister on his return home? Did he want to show it to prospective employers, perhaps, or mount it and hang it on a wall? Or was it perhaps the pièce de résistance in the Dossier he was now preparing for the king on the subject of colonial constitutional abuse? Whatever Grant wanted this certificate for, together these two documents present a remarkable certified text, which might be without any legal or medical standing, and which does not appear to have generated any obvious historical change in 1810, but which to me nevertheless offers something profound. A glimpse of a harried and humiliated governor agreeing with a wild young convict that transportation and the mechanics of the penal colony of New South Wales had driven a man to madness, or something like it. The story as a whole, which is the first chapter of my book, opens up a wonderful and intimate view of early colonial Sydney. But it's more than this. The life history of a man with a borderline mental condition, the uneasiness of the second certificate or the derangement of the first, or what the famous chaplain Samuel Marsden called in another character reference he gave him when John Grant finally managed to sail home. Marsden called it a wildness. Following this wildness and seeing what Grant allowed himself to think and feel and say and write shows something of what the system, of what historical reality of transportation could do to a person. And in doing so, it shows the knots and twists in this history. It shows pathological systems taking shape, taking form in this young colonial society. It does something, I think, which Bentham's critique of transportation, caustic as it is, or Molesworth's pontifications about the corrupting effect of transportation on colonial society, without a moment's reflection on what it might have done for the culture of empire that he was bound up in himself, something these official, rational, and exceedingly coherent documents never could. The history of madness has a rare ability to cut through much of the civility and rhetoric, to point to paradoxes and incongruities, to show, by revealing incoherent responses to the incoherence of individuals, the way history is shot through with madness, with wildness, with derangement, well beyond the history of formal mental illness. It's a subversive and dangerous field, kept often at arm's length by readers, I think, because it tends to make mockery of the sober, reassuring narratives of social reform, of collective wisdom, political progress, that still undergird most of our stories of self and society, whether or not we like to admit it. It's also, I think, a dangerous field for historians, because by spending time on madness and with the mad, by plunging into their experience and working through their incoherence, this field exposes our continuing reliance on rational mechanics in the meaning that we seek to thread through our narratives, our histories. It brings into the glaring light the way our methods and the stories we write from the material of the human past betray our dependence and rationality that we may, when we think about it, have philosophical objections to, or at least questions about. We search for data that aligns to this or that concept. We write up narratives which present causal pathways and underlying logics. We need a basic coherence to pursue our craft. Readers of history books, those imagined audiences that we may or may not write for, also expect good, clean story arcs, don't they? Lucid summaries, and the sense, after working through the details we've hauled out of the archives and selected, compiled, carefully, neatly presented, that they have achieved some understanding of a period, a war, a person, a phenomenon. Whether or not historians and their readers are bound by a moral contract, as Inga Glendinning argued, there is, I think, another contract that does bind them, an implicit contract of coherence and signification, one which is little talked about in history, perhaps because of the disconcerting, even dangerous questions that it raises about the practice of history. I want to finish this afternoon with a final reflection from the novelist Michael Ondaatje. His latest book, Warlight, as you may know, comes in two movements. The first half is a first-person account by a teenager, Nathaniel, of how his parents left him and his sister in their London home for several years, cared for by strangers, saying only that they were going abroad for work. In the second movement, an adult Nathaniel is now working in the Secret Service in the aftermath of the war, scrubbing the records clean of malfeasance, of the abuse of power, but also in his spare time looking for traces of his mother, who, it turns out, was a spy. Veronica Scott Esposito, writing for the San Francisco Chronicle, describes how the novel is set in the seepages where events leak out from their tidy chronological spans. Of course, Warlight is the dim light that escaped from the edges of the brown paper, which was used to cover windows during wartime London in the nighttime. It was used also in Sydney, of course. I remember well my grandfather telling me about the brown paper that they used to put up in the nights. This half-light becomes, in the book, a metaphor for the knowledge of the past that Nathaniel pieces together from a mixture of memory, of conversations, what we could call oral history, and archival research in the intelligence collections that he's in the act of officially obscuring. Together, these form a personal and partial narrative of a place and time. The sort of narrative, writes Esposito, not visible in history's typical midday light. The dim light which escaped the homes and factories of wartime London is a powerful analogy for the partial, indistinct knowledge of the past. Knowledge which, as Ondaatje writes, regularly evades historical narratives. Historical studies inevitably omit the place of the accidental in life, he writes. Historical studies inevitably omit the place of the accidental. We seek clear, rational patterns of cause and effect, signal and meaning, to make sense of how we got where we are today. But so often this is not the way the world is experienced. It's not the way relationships play out, decisions are made, cultures evolve. It's not the way historical change works. It might seem that John Grant described a remarkable narrative arc from London to Sydney, Norfolk Island, Phillip Island, back to Sydney, and finally back to London. In another sense, his life offers up a case study in Ondaatje's category of the accidental. This is true in the sense that accident played such a prominent and awful part in the way that he and his madness encountered the world. If he'd been caught dueling so poorly a few years earlier, he might have been let off because of different legal circumstances. And later, he might have been let off because of the doctrine of monomania. It's possible. Accident played a large part in his treatment, in his personal encounters in New South Wales. For better, sometimes, mostly for worse. It's, there's often the wrong street, the wrong lover, the wrong timing, the wrong judge, the wrong patrons, the wrong friends, the wrong governor, the wrong timing again. It's also true in the sense that the course of Grant's life was propelled by what appears to have been some unknown illness, some internal disturbance or madness, which is in the order of the accidental, isn't it? Illness is always in some manner accidental, rather than guided by a mysterious logic, metaphysical or genetic. Mental illness is abundantly more so, a thing of accident. Grant's life also shows that the boundary between diagnosable illness and other kinds of wildness is porous, which makes him a model for the way the accidental threads wreaking havoc through history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. That was fabulous. That was very interesting. I'm now starting to wonder how sane anybody really is. And I think that's one of the questions that I really wanted to ask you was about definitions of madness and who gets defined as mad and when do people slip over in between just being eccentric and just being mad. Because I know that in your book there was some quote from somebody that was talking about MacArthur saying that, okay, so he's now mad in law, but he's actually no more crack-brained than he ever has been. And so I wondered what things in the colony actually determined whether a person was called mad and insane or whether they were just eccentric.
Yeah, look, as in every society, there are different ways you can get into or fall or slip into kind of the more coercive or serious or total forms of control and care. So, the people could be arrested by a magistrate. They might have been kind of dobbed in by their master if they were assigned out to a farm, or by anyone really. They could be arrested and kind of held for observation. A doctor was supposed to come after some time. A doctor was supposed to come and examine them, and then two doctors really. And they would do that. And if they were found to be genuinely unwell, they would be placed in an institution. If they were convicts, that was fine because the institutions were at first for convicts. If they were free people, then they were often let in anyway by kind of a discretionary arrangement. But there were other ways that people could find themselves in care or work their ways into care, and normally with help. I don't think I came across any instances of a person seeking help, apart from that very small story I shared about the woman from Dublin who seemed to be seeking transportation for mental health care. But there were plenty of cases of a brother or a business partner or a parent or a child who requested help from the authorities. And because New South Wales was such a strange place, where the governor basically decided everything through the colonial secretary, it meant that you could just write and ask for help. And there are ways of making that happen, but the governor's authority could do almost anything in the early years, the first couple of decades. And also later on, there was the Supreme Court, and so people could go through quite a formal process. The advantage of that was that it avoided the magistrates, it avoided the arrests and the jails and the prisons. It avoided the taint of convictism, which is a bit of a sore point for a lot of this history that we're talking about. Nobody wanted to be arrested. Nobody ever wants to be arrested. But in a penal colony, it's a particularly sensitive topic to be treated anything like a convict. And so they could go through the Supreme Court, which is very much a legal process. The downside is it's very expensive. And so, that was for the wealthier families who could pay to avoid the ignominy of the legal system.
And so they didn't define, I mean, they would just go and ask for help and someone would step in. They didn't define what was mad.
Well, I mean, the terms are all pretty vague. So there's no DSM, of course. There's no psychiatry. There are legal processes often involved, and the doctor or the magistrate might go and have a close observation and decide for themselves. There are interesting and kind of revealing episodes where the doctor and the magistrate disagree, where people disagree, or the magistrates keep sending the same person to the asylum, and the superintendent of the asylum says, no, they're not actually unwell, they don't belong here. And of course, there you have a clashing sense of what is and isn't illness, what is and isn't a problem for society, or rather, whose problem is this behavior going to end up in? Whose problem is it going to be? Who's going to pay is often the question.
Thank you. So we've got some questions coming through. Kate O'Neill says, thank you for your fascinating talk. And was the Sydney Benevolent Asylum a place of charity and madness?
Thanks, Kate. It was a place of charity and a place of madness, incidentally, I think. I didn't come across a lot of links that I can recall to the Benevolent Asylum. But it was one of those places where the poorer and sadder cases of colonial life were gathered together. So in any of those institutions, the Carter's Barracks is one where the convicts lived. It was on the side of Central Station, and that's one of the places where they were gathered together to do work. There was another place where people would be sent off to the asylum. So you come across occasional cases from different institutions. I'm not aware of any particular treatment that happened at the Benevolent Asylum. I don't think so. It was more like a workhouse or a charitable institution, I think. And so, in the way that any place where there are kind of older people who can't quite manage in the outer world, which is often what it comes down to, they may find themselves in the asylum one way or another. Not a terribly good answer, sorry, but that's the one I have.
Okay, we have a question from Hannah. A wonderful paper and book, Jamie. There's a fascinating interaction between law and medicine. Is one way of telling the story of madness a shift in jurisdiction over madness from law to medicine?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, as your own work is about, Hannah, some of it, the whole professionalization drive of the 19th century, 20th century, especially the 19th century, is part of it here. And for whatever reason, the professional urge and work and organization of doctors is particularly interesting and powerful towards the middle of the 19th century and towards the end of the 19th century on. So, I mean, law is important all the way through and remains an important part of the story of madness, of the way people kind of engage with mental health services here, elsewhere. But of course, yeah, medicine has become more and more the proper, responsible, determinant of whether someone is truly ill or not. I gave a talk a couple of years ago where a forensic psychiatrist came along, and he was deeply, he was very critical of the state of forensic psychiatry, of the kind of role that doctors played in the legal system. And it's been such a fraught history all the way along. When doctors started getting called into courtrooms to give professional opinion, there'd be cases where 10 doctors were called in, and each of them would say something different. And the way it was reported up in the press was, kind of wildly absurd. They would ridicule this medical expertise. And I guess that's the third. I mean, we've got medicine and law, but there's also the kind of court of public opinion, which sounds a bit silly, but it's not actually. That, some of these, it's kind of the step before medicine or law is people who are part of the community and cared for in the community. And often quite well. So I kind of like to keep telling the story that it's not only the professions, it's not only these knowledge systems that are kind of powerful, making these decisions. It's families and communities who are often doing the care, and then at some point they say, no, this person has become too much for us to handle, has become a problem, has become more than we can bear. Again, I think your question was really interesting, and I'd like to give it some more thought, the way you framed it.
Okay, we have another question which leads on quite nicely from that. Through your research, have you evinced early colonial attitudes towards intellectual and physical disabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and not one I dealt with head on in my book, partly because the institutions and the kind of therapies available were not terribly precise. So, you'd have an institution where there would be people who were called things like idiots from birth, or imbeciles, or feeble-minded. So you'd have what would be today called very different words, but a wide range of intellectual disabilities. And they would be caught up in the asylums. Whether or not they'd stay there long depends on the various factors. So, I mean, there's one article by a historian called Beverly Earnshaw, quite an old article now, which dealt with physical disability and intellectual disability. It's not, as I said, something that I dealt with head on. It was more kind of the more acute forms of mental disorder and mental symptoms that I was interested in. But it's definitely a shared history here, and a shared history of sadness and suffering, really. Yeah.
Okay, I have another question, and that is, having just reread your book, one of the things that kept on coming up was, but you didn't make a great deal of, was the role of alcohol, the number of people who drink themselves to death and that sort of thing. I mean, I've found cases of that, particularly of suicide, where a lot of the suicides are people who are alcoholics and when they're in a state caused by this alcoholism, they've gone mad and then they commit suicide. And I wondered if you came across any sort of suggestion that the colonial authorities were trying to actually do something about the alcohol as part of their dealing with the madness, or was the link not made?
I never came across it, not in the early period. I think it was certainly, there's so much talk around alcohol in the early period, but quite a lot of talk around regulating alcohol again in the 50s and 60s, more as a social problem than as a, I mean, I think in the early period is more of there's a behavioral issue and an economic issue, and it was a social order issue. Whereas towards, in the 50s, 60s, it became much more embedded, I think, and much more of a question about social structures or something like that, rather than individual choices. I never in the early period came across people thinking we need to deal with alcohol in order to help people's health. I think it was really more, we need to get them working, we need to get them in a good order, and we need to stop the officers, profiteering in this way, because it's deeply corrupting everything going on here. I mean, Matt Allen is, the great historian on this subject, and I've been meaning to work with Matt to think more about alcohol and madness in the middle of the 19th century. So I guess, stay tuned.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that there's a lot of women who end up in business because their husbands have committed suicide or drunk themselves to death, or are just alcoholics. So it becomes a huge drama. Somebody else would like you to tell us more about the spate of suicides, what years they were, when that was occurring.
It's one of my chapters, which I think is called Darling Suicides, and it's the late 1820s. So it's a pretty tight case study or something, where I just found really quite a lot of suicides, but it's not just the number across the years. It was more that there was quite a lot of talk around suicide. So, I mean, one of the issues I was always grappling with is data, is trying to get as much data as I could and be clear about what was actually happening. And so, I mean, you can never quite tell how many people are suffering mental symptoms. It's not even easy to tell how many people are in the asylum at any one point. But suicides, it's easier to tell because of the way they're reported pretty directly and bluntly in the papers. There's all sorts of interesting analysis you can do on how they're reported, how different people who choose to kill themselves are spoken about in the press, in the courts. Very interesting. But that was particularly interesting because they were talking about suicide a lot, because there was a few key people, it was public figures, and there were some links between them. And so there's some concern that there was sort of not quite a kind of epidemic of suicide, but definitely a whole kind of self-perpetuating phenomenon going on of people choosing to kill themselves in the late 1820s. And particularly around these government figures. And I link it in the chapter with Governor Darling's policies. You know, he was actually conducting a purge. You know, he said he was conducting a purge, that he thought there were all these immoral characters given responsible positions of power. I mean, interestingly, harking back to Atkins and MacArthur and others who did have some serious problems. But Darling thought these were all dissolutes, retrogrades, reprobates, and they shouldn't be in power. And he was going to, fix everything. And there was some suggestion that one man was afraid of losing his job, and obviously was kind of unwell and fearful and anxious, and who killed himself. And the papers laid this at Darling's feet and said, "This is your policy. This is what's happening." And of course, that's one thing you can kind of shake off and argue about. But then there were other suicides, and including some, as I said, that made Darling himself feel quite perturbed and quite confused, because these were not the dissolute characters that he wanted out. These were the upstanding citizens, and some of them were killing themselves. It's yeah.
Cheery. Anyway, Richard White has a question. Did anything come of Grant's dossier, and did anyone see it or anything, or did it just language in the bank?
That is a great question that I don't have an answer to, but I suppose the answer is no, nothing came. And somehow it found its way into a bank vault in London and stayed there for 100 years or more. I would love to know what happened to Grant after he returned. And perhaps it's possible to find out. There are just really actually a lot of John Grants. It's not an uncommon name. And the details of his leaving the colony are not that clear. And even the details of the finding of the documents by a kind of a bank historian, William Hill Reid, are not that clear. And so I would have loved it to be discovered earlier on, or for there to be some hidden history of this dossier, because it would be wonderful. It would be a wonderful dossier, a wonderful document. But the actual dossier is not. It's not extant, I don't think. It's just kind of the reports and writings that are in the journals and letters.
Okay, I have a question from Hilary Hughes. Have there been any studies of English attitudes to madness in the 18th century that might throw light on how the governors, etc., made sense of madness in New South Wales?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of cultural history of madness and social history of madness that's been done, and you could probably work a little harder to kind of show the kinds of things that these governors might have thought about madness. Certainly, I worked hard with Lachlan Macquarie to kind of place him as a figure coming out of the Scottish Enlightenment, not of course as a philosopher himself, but as someone shaped by it, and to see that his views on madness and on particular on asylums and how they should be built and run came partly from the Scottish Enlightenment and partly from his experience in India as an officer who was kind of, traipsing across the world and based in India for some time. And so it is always interesting to think, where do these people get these ideas? Yeah, I mean, different governors had different plans of what to do, what asylums to build. And so partly it's their intellectual makeup that's interesting, what they think madness is and how it should be dealt with. Partly it's, of course, always the realities of treasuries and funds and politics and, complaints that hold up their agendas and things like that. I mean, interestingly, the first person to really push for a proper asylum, Richard Burke, it's partly what's interesting there is that he built it for the free colony, right? He didn't build it for the convicts, because that's something that people used to say, and people have thought on and off, that of course you'd have a whole lot of mental illness where you have a whole lot of convicts, discipline, people coming out of the jail system, out of poverty, out of difficult lives. And that's all true, I think. And yet the first real asylum was built for the free colony and partly because there's a windfall, there was money to do it. So a whole bunch of institutions were built for the permanent free society, thinking that madness was a problem of civilized societies, of free populations.
So Hannah Forsyth has another question. I was fascinated by the practice of moral therapy in your book. Does this amount to something similar to personal responsibility as a political ethic under later democratic systems? Why moral?
It's a good question. Moral therapy is a term that often throws people. It really, and there are some interesting shared histories or kind of interesting intellectual lineage there. But moral therapy really refers to psychological therapy, early psychological therapy. So it definitely has ties to those ideas of personal responsibility. But it refers really to a new push towards the end of the 19th century to treat the mind rather than treat the brain, to treat the body, and to actually try and think with the new tools at their disposal of doctors and others at that point, to try and think about how to actually respond to the human mind. So it came out of some thinking by Locke, other philosophers, and thinkers about what a self was, what a mind was, and how humans might lose their faculties and then recover them. So I mean, moral therapy really meant things like decent food, some rest, sleep, care, respect, talking, occupational therapy, even early, dances, card games, walks in the park. It meant not heroic interventions. It meant not kind of chains and whips and treating people as people who have minds that can recover. Yeah.
Okay, so I did tell you when we were preparing for this that I would ask the gender question, but I don't have to because someone's done it for me. Kate O'Neill says, other than your example of the woman who came to the colonies for her mental health, with an appropriate exclamation mark, were there many notable incidences of women who were institutionalized? And I want to add, and was that by their husbands or children because they were menopausal or because they wanted their money?
Yeah, so there is one prominent case, Esther Abrams, who was committed, I think probably for some of those reasons, money, control, power. She was the widow of George Johnson, if I'm not getting mixed up. I don't think so. And so that is one of those stories that you kind of come across, that kind of whole trope with some basis in reality of women who are institutionalized as yet one more example, or kind of a ratcheting up of the general social control applied to women by their menfolk at this point and always. But yeah, look, it's one of the glaring things about my book is that it's almost all about men, and I don't have a great reason for that. I really don't. It's just that most of the stories that I came across, there were women in the asylums, but not much could be said about most of them. And so, if probably there'd be a social from history from below social history project that could do more with the records that there are, but there just aren't that many records. And so what I was trying to do often just had to work more with the sources that there were. Of course, there were gender imbalances. I mean, there were just a lot of men in the colony, and some of the more prominent people were men in the public sphere. Of course, one thing historians are supposed to do is correct that imbalance as they work. And, I guess that would be the next book, is to do more of that. But I suppose it's just the sources that I found, I mean, a handful of legal cases that were really interesting, all men. The doctors, of course, were men. The magistrates were men. The governors were men. So there are a handful of cases in the book. There are some, but it's I think noticeable and dissatisfying and unsatisfactory, just how masculine this book is.
And would it be a positive thing to say that because there aren't Aboriginal people in there either, is that because Aboriginal people were considered outside their jurisdiction for madness, or is it a bad thing that they're not given the care they require?
It could well be both. But my sense in these early decades, at least, is that Aboriginal people were generally, there was enough cultural intelligence, by and large, for people to kind of recognize what Aboriginal mental illness might look like, mental illness in Aboriginal peoples. I may be wrong, and it'd be really interesting to do a little more work on about the early missions, I think, to kind of see, and other kinds of interactions, to see maybe where mental symptoms fit in those contexts. I didn't do that work, so I'd kind of be really interested to read it if someone else does it, or to have a look myself at some point. There's only so many books you can write, of course.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Anne says, great talk. Any thoughts on the reverberations of the early positioning and narratives of madness in the developing Australia or Australian identity? Is our relationship with madness specific?
It could be. It could be. I don't have any good thoughts about that. There are lots of ways you can go with it. And of course, Stephen Garton, his book takes up a little more, it takes up madness and psychiatry around a more kind of nationalist, the pivot, of course, from the colonies to the states, and from the states to the federal kind of body, political culture. I mean, I suppose one answer would be that there would be multiple specific relations in madness in Australia, because the different colonial settings was really quite different, of course. Sydney, New South Wales would be very different from what happened in Adelaide or Western Australia or Tasmania. Maybe not as much Tasmania. Queensland. I mean, all these really quite different contexts, social contexts, cultural contexts. I mean, look, as I said, the hypothesis I was trying to work with at the start was that exile and transportation must do something to the minds of convicts. It must have done something. However hard it is to access, it must have done something. And then, of course, the way that the penal state functioned, the way that government had such a strong presence in healthcare in the first 50 years at least, 70 years and longer, I think must have had some interesting influence on the kind of the progression of healthcare through the country, through history. I haven't done the thinking about it, and it's one more area that'd be really interesting to pursue. Yeah.
And a final question from Hannah again, so get ready. A friend, this is slightly easier. A friend who runs a reading group in the prisons thought your book was perfect for carceral readers. Have you thought about its resonances today?
I have thought a little bit about its resonances today, and thanks, Hannah, for your engagement. It's been a while since we've been in touch. Hannah was finishing her PhD at Sydney when I started, so it's a real shame that I can't be up there hanging out with you all today. Yes, I've thought about its resonances. I mean, one of the obvious things to think about is how it is about almost a pre-asylum era in mental health care. And what we have now is almost a post-asylum era in mental health care. And what it was about is kind of before there's any real, I would say, real plan for like health care, mental health care, policy, environment. And what we have now, of course, there are policies and plans, but I would argue perhaps still a real confusion about how we should arrange our institutions and our provision of care. And I think most people in healthcare would agree with me, and have certainly in various talks and things. As for people reading it themselves, look, I think one of the resonances a book like this, I hope, can have is that because it isn't medical and it isn't legal, really, and although it's interested in, transportation and the beginnings of the colonial project here, it's also very interested, and I'm very interested in, the experience of mental illness, how it's experienced and how it's understood and interpreted by individuals who are unwell, but also by families, by communities. And just how closely I try and get to the stories and how closely I work through some of those stories, for me, I think it's one important way of talking about illness in a way that we struggle to do sometimes. And history gives us a bit of a remove. It lets us look with a little bit of safety and comfort, I think, in a way that we might not be easily able to do now. And so just to strip away some of the medical language and some of the legal language, to find something that's both similar, but both familiar, but also strange and distant. And then to spend some time with these people, spend some time with this language, which again, sometimes we can find really difficult and uncomfortable at the start, but is again, people just trying to make sense of their world, make sense of what's happening to this person, and make sense really of what to do with these people when there aren't, there isn't a form to fill out, and there isn't an obvious path for them to follow through, and there isn't an obvious person to call or a number to call. So then what do we do? How do we respond? How do we care for this person? So I guess I hope there are some resonances now, because mental illness is everywhere around us, and we talk about it all the time. But I think we can always find better ways of talking about it, and maybe history is one path towards that.
And of course, now we can't just email Governor Bligh and get him to sort it out. So
no, you can't do that anymore.
No. Okay, well, I think we're going to round it off now. Thank you very much, Jamie. That was a fabulous talk, and it was just so interesting. And yes, I really enjoyed having to reread your book, so that was really great. Next time, in 2 weeks' time, we have our very own Emily O'Gorman, who is going to be speaking about the wetlands of the Murray-Darling River, about her new book. Emily is a historian and a historical geographer at Macquarie University, but she is also a member of the Blackheath History Forum Committee. And at the moment, she is our tech guru for this StreamYard thing. So she has multiple strings to her bow. So I hope you will go online and register for Emily when we put the Eventbrite link up. Once again, thank you, Jamie, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you in 2 weeks online again. Bye for now.